Gallic War in context. When reading the De Bello Gallico, it is important to understand the text in context. And that means understanding what happened both before and after the Gallic War. Let's start with how Caesar ended up in Gaul in the first place. To understand how a brilliant and ambitious general rose to power and popularity by conquering a backwater province of Rome, we need to go further back in history to understand the circumstances that created him. Back to the beginning. As the legend goes, Rome started off as a monarchy, founded by the legendary twins Romulus and Remus in 753 BCE. Romulus slew Remus and emerged as the sole ruler of Rome. From its very foundation, then, Rome was a land of cutthroat politics and fratricide. There were 7 legendary kings during the period of monarchy, the last of which is particularly important in understanding Roman values and traditions, particularly their hatred for one-man rule. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud as he is sometimes called, brought about the end of the monarchy with his vicious treatment of his subjects. As the story goes, he raped Lucretia, wife of a prominent Roman senator. Rather than bear the shame of her forced infidelity, Lucretia committed suicide, prompting her husband, father, and brothers to drive Tarquin out of Rome, thus beginning the era of the Republic in 509 BCE. From that moment on, power would never rest in the hands of a single man, or so the Romans hoped, to avoid the unilateral destruction that a bad monarch could unleash. Instead, they would choose 2 consuls to co-rule each year and lead the Senate. Rome underwent several other important political changes as its young republic grew into an expanding empire. As Rome expanded outside the general vicinity of Latium, it began to conquer the various peoples who inhabited the Italian peninsula. Over time, these peoples demanded to be treated as equal citizens as those who lived in Rome. But power was still concentrated in the nobility. While poorer citizens, known as plebeians, could vote, the upper class, known as patricians, had a greater weight of power, ultimately leaving the plebeians with little say in affairs of state. The plebeians conducted a series of armed occupations of key areas in Rome, forcing the patrician-run government to concede powers to them. In this way, they gained access to the Senate and created the office of the tribuneship. Tribunes could veto votes in the Senate and could only be elected from the plebeian order. The conflict between the patricians and the plebeians only further complicated the quest for power in Rome. While there was greater representation and opportunities for those of lower economic standing, the plebeians who actually acquired power were still significantly wealthier than the average Roman citizen. In effect, the conflict of the orders simply created a second tier of aristocrats and expanded the number of individuals who competed for a limited number of positions of power. When a great deal of people all want one thing, they often resort to violence, trickery, and conspiracy. Rome did not have political parties in the way we conceive of them today. The closest thing they had were strategic alignments, groups that shared similar methods and tactics of acquiring power and principles of using that power. These alignments were the Optimates and the Populares. An Optimate believed in traditional paths to power. Most Optimates were patricians, though not exclusively. They believed that the people and families who had always held power in Rome were the most worthy to continue to control Rome. The Populares, on the other hand, were largely criticized for their ambitions. They were often, but not always, newcomers to the political arena. Because they did not have the entrenched political connections of an Optimate, they resorted to populist tactics. Populism should not be confused with liberalism or democracy. While they often overlap in legislative agendas, populist politicians support agendas that win the favor of the common people as a means of acquiring power, not necessarily because of an internal moral imperative to achieve that legislation. They are not mutually exclusive, but nor does populism guarantee true democratic feeling. In Rome, the Optimates frequently opposed legislation proposed by a popularis trying to gain power, only to pass it later when proposed by an Optimate. Gaius Julius Caesar was born in 100 BCE, during the period known now as the Late Republic. Rome had expanded to encompass most of the Mediterranean coast, including northern Africa, Spain, southern France, Greece, and parts of Turkey. Very few external enemies remained for Romans to fight that could actually threaten the center of the Republic. Much of the hostility reserved for outsiders was thus turned inward. The empire was expanding, and more people were jockeying for limited positions of power. The most notable conflict that Caesar observed firsthand was that between Marius and Sulla, two generals, one a popularis and the other an Optimate. Each man had acquired the consulship several times, Marius a record number of times. Their conflict came to a head when the command of the eastern provinces came under dispute. The command was initially awarded to Sulla, but later instead given to Marius. As a result, in 81 BCE, Sulla gathered his armies and marched them on Rome itself, a feat never before attempted and in fact forbidden under Roman law. Sulla declared a state of emergency and assumed the dictatorship, an office that was supposed to be instated in states of extreme emergency, when the Republic was under threat and needed the leadership of a single man. This office was supposed to be temporary, a 6-month position. Sulla used his authority to put limits on plebeian power, which he blamed for the conflict. He reduced their influence in the Senate and reduced the powers of the tribune, key tools of the populares. He also began the practice of proscription, in which he drafted a hit list of his political enemies who could be killed with impunity. While he did take power for longer than 6 months, Sulla did set aside power in less than a year. He participated in politics for only a few years more before retiring to the countryside and later passing away. Because Caesar was a relative of Marius, he was forced to go into hiding during Sulla's dictatorship. Believing it safer, he chose instead to focus on his military career outside of Rome, returning only after Sulla died in 78 BCE. He began to work his way through the political offices, serving first as a military tribune and later a quaestor. In 63 BCE, he served as Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, a prestigious position he won despite running against two significantly more influential senators. Later, he held the office of praetor, then propraetor in Spain in 62 BCE. At this point, still not having recovered his fortunes, which had been stripped away by Sulla 20 years earlier, Caesar was in significant debt. This debt led him to forge an alliance with Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the richest men in Rome. Crassus helped Caesar with his debts in return for opposing his rival Pompey. On return from Spain, Caesar hoped for a triumph to celebrate his military victories. But he was forced to choose between waiting outside the city to be awarded the triumph or entering the city to begin running for consul. Ultimately, he gave up the hope of a triumph and ran for the consulship, which he won. As consul, Caesar began to reach out to Pompey to secure his friendship, despite the rivalry between Crassus and Pompey. They entered into an informal alliance now known as the First Triumvirate. Caesar was still tied to Crassus via his debts, and Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia to cement their alliance. Pompey, at the time, had one of the largest standing armies, loyal due to their frequent successes in the east. In this alliance, Crassus was the money, Pompey the muscle, and Caesar the brains. As a united force, the three managed to pass the majority of the legislation they wanted during Caesar's consulship, further shoring up their power. In particular, they used force to drive away Caesar's co-consul Bibulus, who had attempted to check their power. Much of what they did would have been prosecutable under the law had Caesar stayed in Rome after his term was up. Therefore, it was imperative that he procure a governorship, prevent him from being prosecuted. The Senate tried its best to limit his power, but ultimately was forced to concede the governorship of Illyricum, a region northeast of the Italian peninsula. Shortly after his arrival in Illyricum, the governor of Gaul died, and Caesar was given command of that province as well. This province had much greater opportunities for an ambitious governor. At the time, Rome controlled about a third of the territory they called Gaul, now known as France. Caesar had only temporarily delayed the prosecution of his crimes as consul. He needed to put himself in a position to maintain his governorship, which was set for 5 years, and then use his time as governor to acquire enough power and influence to protect himself when he did finally return to Rome as a private citizen. He needed a war, and the Gauls were only too happy to give him a reason to start one. We will spend a lot of time talking about what happened in Gaul this year, so let's skip ahead now to what happened after Gaul. After 8 years as governor and conqueror, during which he was accused of war crimes, Crassus was killed in Parthia, his daughter, who married Pompey, died, and the First Triumvirate had collapsed. Pompey held the greatest influence over the Senate and ordered Caesar to set aside his arms and return. The province of Gaul was more or less subjugated, with the last rebellion led by Vercingetorix quashed. Believing, probably rightly, that he would be prosecuted for his crimes as consul and as governor of Gaul if he entered Rome as a private citizen, without a magistracy to ensure his immunity or an army to offer protection, Caesar marched his legion across the Rubicon River. An otherwise unimportant river, except for the fact that it was considered the boundary at which a general had to surrender his armies. No standing army was supposed to be brought into the city, although this rule had been defied by Sulla decades earlier. Caesar famously declared, "Alea jacta est," the die is cast. Pompey did not have an army in Rome, and quickly had to gather troops to defend against Caesar's oncoming invasion. Despite superior numbers, he and the Senate fled rather than face Caesar's seasoned and loyal troops. Caesar took Rome with little opposition. He left Mark Antony in charge of Rome and went to Spain to rally more troops. From there, Caesar pursued Pompey eastward, eventually defeating him in Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey himself escaped to Egypt, where he was killed by Ptolemy, who hoped to gain Caesar's favor. Ptolemy was engaged in a civil war with his sister, Cleopatra. Unfortunately, Ptolemy miscalculated and instead incurred Caesar's wrath for the murder of Pompey. After a year in Egypt, helping settle the dispute, all the while at great risk to himself, Caesar returned to Rome, where he pronounced himself dictator for life. In a few short years, the Optimates in the Senate who opposed his populist rise to power eventually conspired to assassinate him. Caesar died on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, but Rome would never return to the republic it had once been, and had not been for about a century. Caesar did not create an empire that required one-man rule, but his rule made it obvious to all that there was no other way for Rome to exist.